All right, welcome to the second AP Psychology Cramathon session. Today we're going to be doing units 5 through 7. All right, so first of all, starting with unit 5, what is a circadian rhythm? Well, your circadian rhythms, if you think back to talking about sleep cycles, this is your 24-hour cycle. It tells your body when to sleep and regulates your internal body clock. All right, so this is all about sleeping and sleep cycle. The different stages of sleep are stage 1. That's where you're like drifting off to sleep. You're not quite asleep. That's where you can get that feeling of like you feel like you're falling and then you jolt awake. All right, you're in stage 1 there. That's where you have alpha and theta waves. Important to know that. So stage 1, just drifting off, alpha and theta waves. Stage 2 lasts for about 20 minutes, and that's where you get your sleep spindles. It was where your heart rate starts to slow down and you start to actually go to sleep here. Stage 3, you have slower waves, like slower delta waves start to appear, and you're in a very light sleep. And stage 4 is straight on delta waves. You're in a deep sleep, and this lasts for about 30 minutes. In stage 4, this is where you could sleepwalk in stage 4 because you're not in a state of paralysis yet. You're not paralyzed, so you can still move around if you do start dreaming here. In stage 5, otherwise known as REM sleep or rapid eye movement, right? That's what REM stands for. Is stage 5. That's where they also call it paradoxical sleep. REM sleep is referred to as paradoxical sleep. If you think of the root word for paradoxical, it sounds a lot like paralyzed or paralysis. All right, that's because that's where you can't move at all in REM sleep. You can't live out your active dreams anymore. There's no sleepwalking. Now remember the difference between a nightmare and a night terror. All right, so nightmares happen in stage 5. It's just a bad dream, but you can't move. Whereas a night terror is happening in stage 4. It's like a nightmare, but more intense because you get to actually move around. And also your sleep cycle, how it works. Important to remember this. You go through stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, REM. Right? And then you repeat, but without stage 1. All right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, REM, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, REM, 2, 3, 4. All right, so that's how your sleep stages work. So it's a cycle of about 90 minutes. 3, what are insomnia, narcolepsy, sleep apnea, night terrors, and somnambulism? Insomnia, that's where you can't sleep. All right, your brain is way too active. There's a lot of stuff going on and you can't get to sleep. Narcolepsy is that stage where you get sudden sleep. We watched a couple videos on this. The one video was like the dogs get really excited over food and they just like pass out. Remember, narcolepsy is the disorder. Right? Cataplexy is what happens within the disorder, and that's where you lose control of your muscles and you just kind of go limp. Narcolepsy is generally brought on something triggers it, and it's an intense emotion. It could be an intense excitement, stress, happiness, whatever. It just triggers it, and then boom, all of a sudden you hit REM sleep. Sleep apnea is where you can't breathe when you're sleeping. So at night you'll have to wear like this Darth Vader-esque mask because you reach those stages in your sleep where you forget to breathe, and that's not good. They actually say that a lot of like when you have infant deaths, it's actually not due to sudden infant death syndrome. Now, are there some that are? Yes, but they found that a lot of them are actually because the baby had an undiagnosed case of sleep apnea and they just stopped breathing in their sleep, and they're so young, like it didn't jolt them awake. So generally, people with sleep apnea tend to have a lot of trouble sleeping. They wake up suddenly in the middle of the night multiple times. It's like, why am I waking up? Maybe you have sleep apnea and you have to wake back up to be able to breathe. Night terrors, like I just said, they are your active nightmares. You'll scream, you'll flail. They're very intense, just as nightmares are, but you move. And somnambulism that's a fancy term of saying sleepwalking. I've never seen it actually referred to as that on the exam, but just so you know, there it is. That's a fancy way of saying sleepwalking. Number 4, what is post-hypnotic amnesia? Post-hypnotic amnesia is the inability to recall what happened when you were hypnotized. So you'll come out of hypnosis and you won't remember what you did when you were hypnotized. All right, so post-hypnotic, meaning after hypnosis, amnesia, you don't remember. Post-hypnotic suggestion, that's where there's an action that's performed after you wake up. So, for example, they'll say, when I clap my hands, you'll wake up and you'll no longer be hypnotized anymore, but you'll do 10 jumping jacks. Clap my hands, you're not hypnotized anymore, but you did 10 jumping jacks, and you're like, why did I just do that? Well, because I left a suggestion behind in your head, so you did it. So, it was after the hypnosis was over, there was a suggestion that was planted there that you carried out. Hypnotic suggestibility. That's basically your willingness to accept hypnosis. All right, we did this with when I had you hold out your hands in class and it was like you feel rocks in one hand, it's getting heavier, balloons in another, it's getting lighter. All right, the further your hands went apart, the higher your hypnotic suggestibility, meaning that hypnosis would probably work on you because you're opening your mind up to uh, allowing that to happen. You're willing to accept suggestion. Whereas if your hands really didn't move at all, probably wouldn't work for you. 5, what are agonists and antagonists? So now we're talking about different types of psychoactive drugs that are going to alter your states. Agonists are anything that they bind to receptors and they cause a reaction. All right. Whereas antagonists block anything from binding to a receptor. So they're inhibitory. So agonists are they're excitatory, and antagonist drugs are inhibitory. So just know that if you see something referred to, they say this type of drug is an agonist, it means it bonds to receptors and makes it do something. If they say that it's an antagonist, it means it's going to block anything else from binding um, to a receptor site on a neuron to keep you from really reacting. Um, 6, what are stimulants and how do they work? Stimulants are uppers, right? They're anything that speed up or stimulate your nervous system. Examples of those would be nicotine, caffeine, and cocaine. Depressants, total opposite of stimulants. They slow down your central nervous system, like reaction time and things like that. Examples are alcohol and barbiturates. And remember, alcohol and barbiturates are the deadly combination because it's like you're doubling up on something that's slowing down your nervous system to the point where it's going to slow down and just stop working. 8, what are hallucinogens? They're like your psychedelic drugs. They cause hallucinations, or in most cases, just simply altering your sensory images. So they alter senses. Even if it's not a full-on hallucination, if it alters your sense in any way, then it's classified as a hallucinogen. Now, LSD, all right, we think, oh yeah, well that's a hallucinogen. All right, that's a psychedelic drug that we know those cause hallucinations. A lot of people tend to argue with this is that weed, like marijuana, actually falls in the hallucinogenic category. People are like, oh, it doesn't cause hallucinations though. No, but it alters your sensory perception, so that's why it's classified as a hallucinogen. So some people will confuse weed and they'll put it in a depressant because it's like it slows you down, but no, it is classified as a hallucinogen. Opiates. Opiates relieve pain. They're your pain relievers that put you in a euphoric state. You're like, oh, I'm so happy, I love everything type of place. Um, Examples would be like heroin, morphine, a lot of really heavy painkillers. They're very, very addictive. Um, so they just put you in this euphoric state and it relieves pain. Uh, if you have any questions about any of the types of psychoactive drugs, stimulants, depressants, hallucinogens, opiates, I suggest go back and Google that mouse party thing and play that again and see how those work. What did Hildegard add to the knowledge base about hypnotism? We really didn't talk about Hildegard, but basically what he did was he created this hypnotic suggestibility scale, which basically measures how easily a person can be hypnotized. So basically he assigned you a number, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how suggestible are you for hypnosis? That's pretty much what he did. All right, so that is Unit 5. All right, so now let's move on. 11. What is diconic listening and selective inattention? Well, diconic listening is it investigates selective attention. So like in one ear, out the other. So how they tested this was they'd give you a headset and they'd have somebody saying something into the left side of the headset, somebody saying something into the right side of the headset, and they'd say, all right, now what did you hear? And whichever thing you report hearing, that's the side that you tend to listen to the most. Do you listen more with your left ear or do you listen more with your right ear? So that was like this dichotic listening test. Selective inattention is your lack of attention towards an unpleasant stimulus or anxiety provoking stimulus. So we know that selective attention is where you're selecting what to pay attention to. Selective inattention is kind of the opposite of that. You're selecting what not to pay attention to and really like drown out and avoid. And basically, it's going to be something that is unpleasant. That's why you're selecting not to pay attention to it deliberately. 12, what is classical conditioning? That's where you establish association between different events and stimuli. The one that's credited most heavily for classical conditioning is Pavlov, or if you think Pavlov's dogs. That's a classic case of classical conditioning. It's where you're learning to associate something with something else. So you had he wanted to, it was dogs, all right, and saying, okay, well, when I bring out food, they salivate, all right. So your unconditioned stimulus, the thing that they salivate to no matter what, just naturally, is the food. So your unconditioned stimulus is the food. Your unconditioned response is them salivating because that's natural. Now you pair your unconditioned stimulus, which is the food in this case, with a neutral stimulus that on its own there's no reaction to. All right, so let's say a bell. All right, so I pair the unconditioned stimulus, the food, with the neutral stimulus, the bell, and I keep doing that. Now, once you've paired those two together, your neutral stimulus, that bell, now becomes your conditioned stimulus. So now instead of salivating to the food, they're going to salivate at the sound of the bell because usually you present it with the other thing, the food. All right, so your conditioned stimulus is the bell, and now they're salivating at the sound of the bell and not the food. All right, hopefully that made sense. If not, there's a worksheet that you guys should have, a whole packet of different examples where you had to identify all these different things. You could look it up on YouTube or ask me if you need any further clarification on classical conditioning because it's totally different than operant conditioning. You need to know the distinct differences between the two. 13, what is stimulus generalization? That's where you're responding similarly to similar stimuli. So for example, if you were sadly attacked by a dog, all right, let's say now you're not afraid of just dogs, but anything that resembles a dog. Maybe you're afraid of all dogs or even wolves or all animals. All right, you're lumping everything together into a general category. That's stimulus generalization. Stimulus discrimination is the opposite. It's where you've learned to respond to a specific type of stimulus. You're discriminating. So if you were attacked by a chihuahua, you're not going to be afraid of all dogs. You're going to be afraid of chihuahuas. Right? It's very specific. And discriminative stimuli is basically the presence of which particular response will be reinforced. So you're looking for a particular response and you're reinforcing that particular response. 14, what is operant conditioning and who's best known for this? Operant conditioning is behavior is strengthened with reinforcements and punishments. All right, the most famous person for this was B.F. Skinner with the Skinner box. All right, so this one was based on rewards and punishment. Now, the difference between, well, reinforcements, first of all, for 15. Whether it's positive or negative, reinforcements are meant to increase a behavior and punishments are meant to decrease a behavior. So with positive reinforcement, you're adding something to increase a behavior. So you're giving them something they like to increase a behavior. Negative reinforcement is you are taking away something in order to increase a behavior. Right? Positive punishment is you're adding something bad that they don't like in order to decrease a behavior. And negative punishment is you're taking away something they like to decrease a behavior. All right. Now, don't get, a lot of times people get negative punishment and positive reinforcement confused. Please make sure that you know the difference. All right. Um, 16, how do schedules of reinforcement work? Well, you've got your fixed and variable ratio and fixed and variable interval. Fixed ratio is where let's say every 5 times um, you get a phone call, you get a piece of candy. This is a dumb example, but there you go. It's a certain amount of times, right? And it's the same every time. Whereas variable would be, it's random. You never know when it's going to happen, but it has to deal with an amount of time something happens. Whereas interval is over time, like actual time, minutes, hours, whatever. Um, Fixed interval, same amount of time every time. Variable, it's different each time. Um, 17, how does learning relate to taste aversions? Well, we basically, you avoid foods that make you sick, right? You develop taste aversions. You learn to avoid things that make you sick. For example, if you've ever eaten something and then you've thrown up from it, odds are you really don't eat that, whatever that was, anymore, right? Because you associate getting sick with it, right? That's a taste aversion. We generally learn to do this with poisons. It was a survival thing, right? I know we talked about in class when people receive chemotherapy. Generally, it makes you feel very sick, but you kind of have to have had something in your stomach. And people don't want them to eat something that they like and then go through chemo, and then it's like now you associate that food that you used to like with getting sick, and nobody wants that. So they'll give you like odd flavored popsicles, so that way if you do develop a taste aversion, it's to that, and that's not really going to hurt you or cause you to starve or anything, or it's not something you eat on a daily basis. All right, so go ahead, give yourself a break right here. Let everything sink in. I'm just going to pause my recorder, go get a snack, and then we'll come back and talk about the remainder of the units here, so units 6 and 7. All right, we're back. So now we're moving on to number 18. All right, how do different perspectives explain learning? Well, first of all, your behaviorism perspective, behavioral, excuse me, you learn through either observing or operant or classical conditioning, right? Um, Psychoanalytic or psychodynamic is from your unconscious and your past. Cognitive is you learn through your mental processes, that IP model I talked about a little while ago. Humanism is, it's about your self-image and inner feelings, and that's how you learn. So like self-actualization. Um, Through biology, you learn through, because it's all genetic. Evolutionary is you've evolved. Um, so those are how the different perspectives explain learning. What is shaping and chaining for number 19? Shaping is where um, you're using behavioral psychology with both of these, but shaping is where you gradually mold and train. So like you use baby steps to get somebody to do what you want them to do, like a system of rewards and punishment. And it's baby steps getting them to the right point. Remember the one time in class where I took someone outside of the classroom and I told you guys, hey, as they get closer to the pom-pom or whatever it was we were looking at, you're going to clap for them, and when they get further away, you're going to get silent. Or we did vice versa. The further away they get, you're going to boo them and hiss and all this stuff, and the closer they get, you're going to get silent. All right, that's where we were using shaping. All right, chaining is very similar. It's basically those steps that you showed them in shaping. Now you're going to link them together in a chain. All right, so number 20, what is latent learning? Latent learning is any type of learning that occurs without reinforcement. So given operant and classical conditioning, it's all because of rewards and punishments or because you've learned associations. Latent learning says, well, none of that was actually present. You just learned it because you did. For example, when you're driving a car, when you got in the car for the first time, how did you know that uh, what to do? All right. Was there a reward ever? Did you learn to associate anything? Probably not. You learned it through observing. You didn't need a reward to know how to drive the first time. You kind of just knew what to do, at least basics, right? 21, what is a locus of control? Well, you have internal and external locus of control. Locus of control are what is your motivation? All right, so internal locus of control would be you're internally motivated. You are self-motivated. Whereas external locus of control is you really rely on outside sources or people to motivate you. And how does this relate to learned helplessness? Well, first of all, learned helplessness is the act. You act as if uh, you're helpless, like something happened, um, and no matter what, you've either failed at something so many times, or you've been told you're going to fail at something so many times that you stop trying. You're like, well, I'm going to fail anyway, right? So you learn to be helpless. And generally, people who have external locus of control, this is more likely to happen to people that have that because they're relying on outside sources to feel motivated. So if those outside sources aren't there or are putting them down, they're more likely to learn helplessness and get down on themselves than if they're internally motivated. 22, what are observational learning, tutelage, modeling, and vicarious conditioning? Well, observational learning, that's pretty self-explanatory. You learn by watching others. You learn through your observations. Tutelage is being under direction of a guardian, or it's the guardian themselves, the one that's really like doing and showing um, people what they're supposed to be doing. So the one who's modeling things, um, which brings me to modeling. Modeling is to show. All right, so I am modeling something for you. Uh, you generally see this in science classes. The teacher who's doing the lab will do it first, and then you do it. All right, the they are modeling the behavior for you. All right, and then likewise they are the person with tutelage, so they're like the leader. And vicarious conditioning that's where you learn your attitudes, feelings, emotions, and beliefs from observing other people. All right. So, for example, when you're like 5 years old, if you're 5 years old and you're spouting political opinions and things like that, generally that's from something you've observed. All right. We watched a video with the one kid like Linda, Linda, honey. All right. His attitude and mannerisms and things like that. That's vicarious conditioning. He learned that by observing. Oops. What is, I lost your train of thought. Oh, here we are. What is the standard model, information processing model, serial model of memory? Those are all different ways of saying the same thing. We talked about it as the IP model or the information processing model. Just know that standard model and serial model, they mean the same exact thing. All right. That's where you had that the computer analogy. All right, so it comes in through your sensory memory. So think about that as the sheet of paper or that you get. It goes into short-term or working memory, which is where you actually start working with it, and then on into long-term where it gets stored. So think of a file cabinet. All right, and then there's going to be times where you need to get it out of your long-term memory, like take it out of storage and retrieve it and put it back into short-term memory so you can work with it some more. It's important to know that anything that you're working with, types of information, can drop off at any point. All right. Sometimes some of the stuff that you're taking in through your senses doesn't make it into your working or short-term memory because you're selectively filtering things out. And sometimes what you're working with in short-term memory doesn't make it into long-term. This is where you generally have to attach visual cues or some type of meaning to something, so you need to know where to put it. What are the three components of the IP model? Well, that's basically what I just talked about: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. The different types of memory. What is episodic memory? Episodic memory is like autobiographical events, times, places, and emotions. Semantic memory is your personal experiences. So like, how did you learn names of colors or the sounds that letters make or the capitals of cities, right? That's in semantic memory. Declarative memory, also referred to as explicit memory, those are facts, or they're very concrete things. Procedural memory is learn how to do things. Okay, where were we? 26. What is, no, we still didn't finish 25. Everyday memory is everyday memory. Procedural memory is how to do things like walking and riding a bike. Like you go through a step-by-step procedure. And flashbulb memory is something that's so vivid, um, and like it's a very shocking event that you remember it in complete clarity. For example, 9/11. If you ask anybody that was around for that, it's a flashbulb memory for them. They can remember the event vividly, tell you everything they were doing. Like it's permanently like ingrained in their brain. 26. What's the difference between prospective memory and retrospective memory? Wait, prospective memory is kind of like remembering the future. Like I need to remember to do this later. All right. Whereas retrospective memory is remembering something that happened in the past. 27. What is the difference between retroactive and proactive interference? Um, and between explicit and implicit memory, and between recall and recognition. So, between retroactive and proactive interference, proactive interference is where you've lost, it's a loss of new memory. Whereas retroactive interference is it's a loss of something old, an old memory. Explicit and implicit memory. Explicit memory, remember we talked about that a little bit earlier with number 25. It's your declarative memory, so it's facts. Whereas implicit memory is non-declarative, so it's like it's skills. And the difference between recall and recognition. Recall, that's where you really don't have any clues around a given question or situation. You kind of have to come up with it based on what you know. For example, your FRQs. All right. You have to recall information and bring it out of long term without any cues or clues. Recognition, that's where you get some hints to kind of help you out to be able to recognize certain things. So, for example, multiple choice is an example of recognition, and FRQs are an example of recall. 28, what are the two types of rehearsal? Well, you have maintenance rehearsal and elaborative rehearsal. Maintenance rehearsal is where you just repeat the same thing over and over and over and over again. All right, rote memorization is basically what that is. So, for example, when you're in a play, all right, for drama, all right, you're using maintenance rehearsal because you're doing the same lines over and over and over again. All right, and that's how it's sinking in. Whereas elaborative rehearsal is you're learning new information with existing skills and memory already there. So, for example, when you're playing a sport, all right, you know the rules, you know what to do during situations, but it's not the same every time, right? All right, so think of maintenance rehearsal is to play, like a drama, whereas elaborative rehearsal is to sports. What are the main types of mnemonic devices? Now, mnemonic devices are basically anything that helps you to memorize something easier. You have methods of loci, which are based on place, right? Loci, like location. So, for example, if you have to remember this whole big speech, um, break it down into certain, like where you learned it. Certain locations, like at the door, I'm going to recite the introduction. When I get to lab station 1, I'll be in my first body paragraph. Lab station 2, I'll be in my second body paragraph, and so on down to like by the time I'm at my desk, I'll be at the conclusion. So it's you're memorizing each specific part based on a certain location. Then you have acronyms, which is where you take the first letter of a word and form it into a phrase. All right, like PEMDAS. All right, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. All right, that's an example of an acronym. We've used a couple in class as well. You've probably used them in several of your classes to help you memorize different things. Rhymes, chunking, all right, where you break things down. Using images like visual cues, things like that. Peg word, where that's where you kind of make up a jingle, kind of help you to remember something, or a list. 30, what are the theories of forgetting? Well, there's decay theory, which is basically you just forget something over time. It's been a while and it's decayed and gone away. Displacement, which is where you're trying to memorize something new, so you got to kick out something old, something else gets displaced. And then interference, which is basically something is interfering with a new type of learning. right? So it's not sinking in because something is interfering with that. All right, 31, what are networks of association? How do they work? That's basically like, go back to mnemonic devices, particularly visual cues. You're associating something with something else to be able to remember it. Okay, and then what is chunking? I already said it earlier. It's when you're breaking things down into smaller groups to be able to memorize it. For example, your social security number or your telephone number. If you had to memorize that number without any of those dashes there, it'd be a lot harder. What is a prototype? A prototype is like, it's the best example or cognitive representation that you have for something. Within a certain category, it's used to enhance your memory. So, for example, if I say bird, what's the first picture that comes to mind? Right? Let's say you thought of a cardinal or a robin. Whatever that is, that's your prototype for birds in general. Right? That's the best cognitive representation that you have. Um, how do people categorize objects? Well, you categorize them by, this is like how you group things, by similarity, proximity, closure, and continuity. 35, what's the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning? Inductive reasoning is very broad generalizations, and you use those to form a specific observation. Right? Whereas deductive reasoning is where you break something down, um, and it's basic, valid, and you narrow things down to a specific goal. So to to deduce, to break down until you have a specific goal. Whereas inductive is like you're including all this stuff, and it's all very general. 36, what are the main brain structures related to memory? I think we've talked about this in the last review. You've got your hippocampus for short-term memory, right? That's where everything's kind of stored for a while. Your cerebral cortex, that's once it's committed to long-term memory, it joins that whole big portion of your brain. Thalamus, because that's the relay station. That's what sends things from sensory organs to the part of the brain it's supposed to go to, including your memory. And finally, your amygdala, because if you attach emotion and meaning to something, it's going to help you to remember it. Not to mention the amygdala is like right up against the hippocampus. So in order for it to make it to the hippocampus, to be able to work with it and put it into memory to begin with, it's got to make it through the amygdala. 37, how much information on average can be held in your short-term memory? About 7 things plus or minus 2, depends on the person, but on average 7. So remember that, 7 plus or minus 2 for the average of what can be held in your short-term memory. 38, an example of serial positioning effect or primacy recency effect. That's how we refer to it in class. If you remember, uh, you remember the most, that which comes first. Second, that's that which comes last, and least, the stuff that's in the middle. So if you think about it, when you were coming up with your lesson plans with this unit that we talked about, you used primacy recency effect. So you had to do all the new information in the very beginning because that's what they're going to remember the most. All right. And then you start like working with things that you just learned in the middle. So that way it's not like new information they're going to forget. And then at the end, all right, you're able to maybe do something a couple more new things. All right. So most, that which comes first, second, that comes last, and in the middle, that's what you remember the least. All right, think of it as a roller coaster. 39, what are phonemes and morphemes? Phonemes are basic sound units. So like ba, da, ka, like those don't have any meaning. It's just a basic sound unit. Whereas morphemes are a basic sound unit that actually carries a meaning. All right. So it's a sound. It's like it's one syllable, but that syllable has a meaning to it. Um, what is language acquisition device, or LAD, and who proposed it? This is basically how children acquire speech, and they acquire it in stages. And the guy that came up with this was Noam Chomsky. What is the critical period hypothesis, and what age is the cutoff? The critical period hypothesis is the ideal time window for you to be able to acquire specific things such as language, mainly. After which, if you miss that window of time in which you were supposed to have learned it, it could become very difficult, almost impossible for you to like make up for lost time and learn it later. For example, when we talked about Jeannie, all right, was she retarded from birth or was it because she missed critical periods for learning how to speak? All right. Um, the critical period hypothesis is basically the reason behind when we watched that video with the baby getting the like cataract surgery for sight, or the cochlear implant for being able to hear. Because if you can't see or you can't hear early in life, and then all of a sudden you can later, you've missed the window for how to be able to identify and say certain sounds and all that stuff. And generally, they think that the cutoff for this is between ages 3 and 4. So if by age 3 or 4, um, you can't hear or can't see or have those social interactions to be able to figure those things out, you may never be able to. 42, what are the availability and uh, representatives heuristics and how do they connect and bond rationally? Well, availability is where you judge the frequency of something. Someone it occurs based on how easily the information comes to mind, how available information is to you. And the representativeness is basing judgments on how similar things are to other things. So, for example, availability, a good example of that would be, for example, oh, you are you more likely to die in a plane crash or of diphtheria? Right. Most people would say, oh, well, you're more likely to die in a plane crash because that's what's available to come to your mind a lot easier than dying of diphtheria because you really may not know much, if anything, about that, when actually it's more common to die from that. So you make your assumption based on mentally what image is more readily available to you. And then, for example, the representativeness heuristic, if it looks like X, then it must be X. Right? That's it. Um, what are algorithms? They're step-by-step procedures, um, and they produce one solution. All right, you use these in math. We'll use them in psych as well. And finally, what are the babbling and telegraphic speech? They're stages of speech. Babbling, like babies, that's what they start doing. All right, those little sounds that they make. They're not words. They're morphemes. Not morphemes. They're phonemes. Sorry. They just start babbling and saying and doing random noises. And then you have your telegraphic speech, where you think of, if you know what telegrams are, um, it's like you talk like that. It's a two-word stage. All right, like when a kid points and they say, "Want cracker." Like they're not. It's not a full sentence, but you know what they mean, and they only use two words. All right, so that's it for this review. Sorry it took so long, but we covered a lot in a very short period of time. Again, what I would recommend doing is going back and looking at some of those review questions, particularly using Learnerator. I think that that helps the most. So thank you, and I'll see you in class. Do you have any questions? Let me know.